The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
That's one of the most exciting things to me about collaboration, is that you're forced to kind of remove your own intentions from the process and pay enough attention to the process that you can be aware of the potential that is there that you didn't bring to it.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Now, after Sir Galahad had smitten down Sir Lancelot as aforetold of, he rode for a long while in a wild forest and had many adventures of divers sorts, of which no account hath been given, though mention is made of them in the ancient histories of those things which I have read. So begins the 7th chapter of the story of the Grail and the passing of Arthur, as recorded by Howard Pyle. And so begins the Lost Tales of Sir Galahad, a new collection of stories from Rabbit Room Press. When illustrator Ned Bustard ran across that passage in Howard Pyle's 1910 book, he thought, wouldn't it be fun to read the stories of Galahad's adventures of diverse sorts in that wild forest? Actually, Ned thought, wouldn't it be great to illustrate those stories? But first the stories needed to be written. So he talked to Pete Peterson, the publisher at Rabbit Room Press. And Pete talked to his wife, the writer and editor Jennifer Trafton. And Pete and Jennifer rounded up 15 or 20 writers who wrote the stories that became the Lost Tales of Sir Galahad, illustrated by Ned Bustard. In this episode of the Habit Podcast, I speak with Pete Peterson and Jennifer Trafton about how this beautiful book found its way into the world. Pete Peterson, Jennifer Trafton, I'm so glad to have you on the Habit Podcast today to talk about a book that I've been looking forward to for a long time, The Lost Tales of Sir Galahad. Did I say that?
I'm happy to be here. Yeah, Lost Tales of Sir Galahad.
Thanks for having us.
So this book was originally the brainchild of Ned Bustard. He had a great idea for a book. Talk to me about where it came from.
Yeah, so Ned and I worked together in Rabbit Room Press. We worked together a couple of years ago to put out a new edition of The Light Princess by George MacDonald. Mm. Ned kind of had the idea. He just really wanted to illustrate it primarily, I think. Came to me and said, hey, if I illustrate this, can we put out like a fresh new, edition of it? And I was like, heck yeah. We had for years wanted to reissue some of George MacDonald's works. Mm-hmm. So that was a great process. And we ended up putting out what was a gorgeous book, which is a great experience for everybody. And as soon as that was off to the presses, Ned came and said, hey, I got an idea for another similar kind of thing. And I was like, okay, shoot. And he said, well, I've been reading the story of, the Grail and King Arthur's Passing by Howard Pyle. And I think we could write a collection of Arthurian tales. So the quote that got him all excited was, now after Sir Galahad had smitten down Sir Launcelot, as aforetold of, he rode for a long while in a wild forest, and had many adventures of diverse sorts, of which no account hath been given, though mention is made of them in ancient histories, and those things which I have read. So that really tantalized his imagination, and it opens up the potential to just do anything with the Galahad story.
Yeah.
You know, so as long as Galahad doesn't find the Grail, you know, because he hasn't actually set out to accomplish that yet, you've got, you know, just kind of carte blanche to be able to do anything you want with the story. And it's, you know, just a field ripe for fun.
Yeah. And
so he said, let's get all of our friends together and just write short stories about Galahad. And I thought, okay, that sounds really easy. Let's do that. And of course, he wanted to illustrate the whole thing. I think especially he wanted to illustrate a bunch of weird monsters.
Yeah.
But like, if you know Ned's work too, like, you know that his kind of focus is on, you know, like medieval imagery.
Yeah.
And so he does linocuts, and his work is full of symbolism and images from Christian history. And so I think the idea of working in Arthurian legend with creatures and knights and all of this various symbolism just lit him up. So I thought, well, let's just charge forward and do that.
And
well, so it got complicated. And the reason it got complicated is when you say, hey, we'll get all our friends to do this fun thing, that sounds great until you realize how busy all of your friends are.
Yeah.
So, you know, we thought, you know, I'll write one, and Jennifer will write one, and Andrew will write one, and Jonathan will write one. It's just everybody in our whole little kind of close-knit community could write one of these stories. Only short stories are really hard.
They are.
They're really hard, and they take time. And it just turned out that while everybody wanted to, few had the time to actually accomplish it. So eventually we got to the point where we've got 5-ish, you know, kind of short stories for this book. And we thought, man, that's a really thin book. I don't know that this was really the vision. So Ned started thinking, who else can I invite? And he invited some folks in his circles. And that started coming together. And then ultimately we thought, you know, you, Jonathan, with your whole Habit community, you've got all sorts of talented writers out there. What if we invited that community to be a part of it and just see what happens? And it was risky. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Like when you start inviting people to write whose work you do not know, you really don't know if you're going to get anything usable or not. And it was delightful to see that there was all sorts of good stuff coming in. And we really got to turn into, you know, kind of cherry pickers. We got to come through and really pick the things that we loved.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
I was
Jennifer,
so thrilled that the something like a dozen stories came in from the Habit community, I think.
We got more than
they got
more
selected.
than that.
We had an avalanche of submissions. It was wonderful. And so we had to winnow down, and we can talk more about that selection process later, but I think we whittled it down to 12-ish.
And that's really where Jennifer came in too, because I was originally going to be the editor. And then when we got this avalanche of stories, I was just like, oh my gosh, because I'm involved in, you know, 3 or 4 other books at the time and various other things, and just didn't have time to do the combing through and the editing and the feedback on all these folks. So I asked Jennifer if she would help, and she's been amazing.
Yeah. Well, Jennifer, I love so there's the one, we sort of have a frame story within the frame story, right? I mean, we've got the idea of the wild forest with the missing tails, which was really fun. But then there's the question of why suddenly have all these works appeared in 2022 that were lost, you know, centuries ago. So, Jennifer, tell me about the other frame story that you came up with.
Oh, that was so fun. And originally, when I think that Ned had pitched it, he had this idea of, you know, the lost stories that have been discovered, and then we're sort of, you know, the conceit being that we're adding all these scholarly commentary and footnotes and stuff. I love that idea. So I had in mind something akin to like the Dead Sea Scrolls discovery. And my dad is a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar.
Okay.
And like I grew up, we as a family, we grew up with like Dead Sea Scrolls as just a a thing that we all knew and we talked about. And my dad had a game that he would play with his students, and our family helped with, of creating all these manuscripts that we would like tear up and smear jelly on and burn the edges of.
Oh, wow.
We would write all these different manuscripts, and it was, he was recreating the process of the discovery of all these things, and then how you put them together and how you decipher them. So my brain went to that, and I sat down and I picked my dad's, my dad's brain for an afternoon about, like, okay, well, tell me about exactly how the things were discovered and how the various states of the different manuscripts. So I had that piece in my head of like, okay, what if I do a comedic version of this, instead of the shepherd boy throwing a stone into the cave of Qumran, I have a tourist throwing a selfie stick into the Merlin's cave in Tintagel, and but then one of the earliest stories that came in, one of the earliest submissions that I read, at least, was Tracy Hackle's story, which was about 4 lines of actual manuscript and pages and pages and pages of footnotes. Hilarious and brilliant. And it was exactly what I had been hoping for in terms of that kind of tone of mock scholarly seriousness about something very, very, ridiculous. And her submission was such a gift in that early stage of the process for me, because she came up with the Society of Galahadic Study and Emulation, a whole cast of scholarly characters led by N.I.T. Witt. And she had come up with a kind of origin story that we ended up massaging a little bit. So it was just such a gift, because I had all this raw material in her footnotes. Yeah. Of things that could be running jokes throughout the whole book. And so then that was the other piece in my brain, the Dead Sea Scrolls idea, and her wonderful, crazy, massive footnotes. And so that's why I wrote this intro, and then I went back to Tracy, and we edited and added a few details to her footnotes just to make it consistent, but otherwise that was all her. That was all Tracy. Those footnotes are all hers.
Oh, that's so funny.
Once we had that overall conceit, it was just Pete and I just had a blast going through the whole collection and adding footnotes to just add to this whole overarching story. That it was fun. It was fun,
and it was also fun. Like, it's not just that we've discovered these stories, but we're treating it as if it's history. Yeah. Like, Galahad was a real person. Yeah. Like, and he was lost, and we have discovered the answer to these questions. Yeah. And that's what made it so fun.
Yeah. And you also had the problem of, because the writers of these stories weren't cooperating with one another, you've got all kinds of contradictions and differences in tone and
exactly.
So that was one of the most fun things for me was the contradictions, because that presents so many fun footnote opportunities. So, like, there's one story early in the book where Merlin shows up and is like a character. And then there's another story later where Merlin is actually dead for 1,000 years in a tomb or something. And so, like, you think about it, okay, do we have these in the right order? And, what do we do? And the ultimate answer is, oh, you footnote it and you acknowledge that one of these people is lying. We don't know how to justify this. Therefore, something is up. It just gets into a whole bunch of fun stuff.
Yeah.
But it was, the tonal thing was really interesting. Yeah. And I think, the tones that we got ran the gamut from like really kind of recreations of medieval tales that just fully lean into the syntax and the spellings and the super moralistic kind of allegorical, way those tales work, where everything is this is Jesus and this means the Holy Spirit and that kind of thing. So some of those are like complete recreations of the tales of the period. And then there were others that are just completely goofy and, Monty Python-esque on the other end. And some were just very wistful and beautiful and really lovely pieces of literature. And so trying to reckon with, okay, how do we fit all these into one book was really a big part of the puzzle. And I know, I think one good example is Junius Johnson, who is a scholar who loves medieval literature. I think he studied maybe at Harvard or Yale, got his doctorate in medieval literature. Sorry, Junius, that may be wrong, but it's something like that. But, he submitted his first tale, and it was absolutely him kind of geeking out about the opportunity to recreate this thing that he loves in great detail in his own way. And it was great in that way, but it just didn't fit with the tone of everything else. And it ultimately wasn't, I don't think, as fun to read as it needed to be, because it was this recreation thing rather than a reinvention. And so we actually went back to him as hey, you did great work here, but try something in this direction, and just gave him, a few ideas about a way to do it, and that brought it into the modern era in a little bit clearer way. And so he went back and completely rewrote a whole new story. And I think he just knocked it out of the park. Yeah. So he's still very clearly referencing all the things he loves from medieval literature, but it's accessible, and it's readable, and it's fun. And, it's what Tolkien talks about in his Cauldron of Story, right? Whenever we sit down to write, we're taking a scoop out of all the stuff that's stirring around in our brain, and we're putting it together into something new. And so, I think Junius's first story was his recreation of a recipe that somebody else wrote. Does that make sense? Yeah. And then his second story is him actually dipping into the Cauldron Story and creating something new that's his out of all the flavors that are in his own pot.
Yeah. It's really fun to look through these stories, most of which were written by people I know, and to see, okay, this is the subject matter. They were constrained on their subject matter, but this still seems like this person's obvious, from what I know of this person, of course they wrote this. Yeah. And, in my story, there's basically a frontier boaster. And as I was kind of, I love those kind of Western frontier boaster type stories. And once I realized that tradition goes all the way back, to, many centuries back in Europe, I thought, oh, I know where this story's going, Yeah.
And that was so much fun to see that the variety of tone and style, and to allow them to all coexist in this one book. That was, we talked a lot about that. How do we, there's a kind of honoring of the past and an honoring of the stories of the past by recreating and preserving. And that would have been a beautiful book. And there's a kind of an honoring the past that is taking a seed and then planting it in your own soil and seeing what comes of that. And that was the kind of book we were excited about doing. It was that second kind of book. Yeah. Of just seeing, okay, drop this seed into different people's imaginations and see what comes out that is their own. And that was really exciting to us. Yeah.
Yeah. And then even the editorial process of figuring out how to make a coherent book out of all of these styles was problematic. Jennifer and I beat our heads against the wall a lot trying to figure out how do these two stories coexist in the same book without it seeming just like a mess. Yeah. And I think we really came up with an arc for the book that feels good. And Jennifer, do you want to talk? Because you were kind of the one that recognized the seasonal aspect.
That was really fun for me to think that reconciling the tone. That was definitely a long conversation. But just figuring out the arc of the story itself was really fun because we ended up, we chose stories that had a lot of variety. We were intentionally trying to get different kinds of manuscripts, a manuscript that is completely shredded in all footnotes, a manuscript that is bits and pieces of a journal. So we had all these different, all this variety and all the variety of tone and style and kind of story. But it was fun to me to then think about the content of Galahad's journey and these as episodes in a particular journey, and to figure out what that story arc was. And it a lot of that fell into place very naturally, because I was noticing that many of the stories alluded to the season. And it seemed to follow a pattern, that there were a lot of summer stories that had much more of a innocent, adventuring, fairy tale kind of feel. And then there were others that had a more autumnal feel to them. Like, okay, this is later in the journey. Galahad's tired and he's hungry and he's getting a little bored of all this. And he's and then there were several stories that were set in the winter that had a much more serious, dark tone. And so once I saw, okay, there are a few kind of place marker stories here that have that seasonal change, and others that fit tonally into those seasons. And that gave me a kind of just a framework for thinking about the journey itself, and how, it starts in this very summery, exciting, like we're going off in an adventure kind of way. It hits difficulty. It hits, all kinds of problems, and we end up in the pit of despair, that dark night of the soul. And then we end up with this vision of spring and of release and of a new sense of purpose. And so that's the arc that kind of came about. In a lot of that was just, it happened naturally. And a lot of those more serious, darker themes we've kept towards the end of the book, which felt tonally right. And also there's a kind of maturing that happens over the course of the book for the stories and for Galahad. A lot of the I think the more childlike tales are in the beginning half of the book, and then we get to the more mature sort of stories towards the end, and we see Galahad himself changing and maturing.
Yeah. What I love about
this
that,
is almost. I'm sorry, Pete. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I was going to say what I love about that is the way that this whole collection is settled in the Galahad, narrative, overall, is that he can't have discovered the Grail yet. So all these stories are pre-Grail quest, essentially. And Galahad, according to Arthurian legend, is just this perfect person. Like, he's foretold to be the one who finds the Grail, and all this foretelling about him. And he's like sinless and perfect and beautiful and all these things. And what I loved about this collection is he's none of those things in this, and so then you follow him on this journey through the wild forest. And by the time you get to the end of the book, there's the sense that he has finally become the person who is ready to seek the Grail. And it's just kind of a beautiful arc to me.
I love it. And it seems to me that there's this is sort of an ethos of so many Rabbit Room projects that you sort of tell people, do your thing, and we'll trust that a theme will emerge, a pattern will emerge, whether that's the molehill or the talks at the talks at a hutchmoot, there's no theme, but a theme always seems to emerge.
It is baffling and wonderful. It's one of my favorite things in the world. Like, I feel like I've had the benefit of seeing that kind of thing happen so often over the last decade, where it's become easier for me to trust the process. But it's wonderful and beautiful and terrifying, to just cast the net wide and trust that all the fish you catch are going to taste like they belong in the soup. That's a weird metaphor, but like it really is true, and that's one of the most exciting things to me about collaboration, is that you're forced to kind of remove your own intentions from the process and pay enough attention to the process that you can be aware of the potential that is there that you didn't bring to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're talking like a playwright now.
I mean, that applies to the playwriting process too. You have your own intention, but then once all these other people get involved, they're going to make it something much bigger than what you had planned. Yeah. And embracing that is critical, I think. Like, if you're scared of that, I think what you create is ultimately going to be lesser than it could have been.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's tempting to think of the editor as a person who's sort of a puppet master, sort of who's the boss, who's the boss of the process. And I mean, good editors aren't the boss of the process. I mean, good editors are trying to
They're shepherds of the process.
Yeah, right. And it feels like this particular project, the work y'all did as editors here, is like an exaggeration of what editors are always doing, which is helping the writer be more of herself or himself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's absolutely the way I think about editing. Like, it's my job to help the writer and the story become the best version of itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to get out of the way and help the writer get out of the way sometimes.
Yeah. Now, am I correct in my understanding that the index is or the table of contents is sort of a treasure map for this book? I thought that was a brilliant idea.
Well, we refer to it as the table of malcontents. If you pay too close attention to the table of malcontents, you will be led astray in the wild forest. And the book will contain a map to allow you to find your way through. Yes.
Excellent. Well,
that's all I have to say about it.
We'll let people experience that for themselves.
It's entirely intentional.
Yeah. That's
of course.
The foresight to insert a table of malcontents instead of just a regular table of contents, I thought was just brilliant.
That's right. An editor does not make mistakes. I will also say, along the lines of collaboration, I have never co-edited a book before. And I've certainly never co-edited it.
What did you say, Jennifer?
Our marriage survived it.
Yeah, I was going to say I've certainly never co-edited anything with somebody I was married to. And it got a little heated at times.
Yeah.
But it was a really fun process in the end. It was so fun.
Yeah.
Can you say anything more specific about times that got heated?
Well, I mean, basically, there are times when I'm right.
We have very good arguments about grammar sometimes.
That's very true. I love breaking the rules of grammar, especially if they sound right to my ear and I'm trying to come up with an archaic kind of sound. Mm-hmm. So I can argue my way around my elbow to say something wrong because I want to say it wrong.
Yeah.
And I think Jennifer hates that.
But it is still wrong.
Right.
And she is right.
Yeah.
Most of the time, like we really just thoroughly enjoyed working on it together. We don't get to collaborate together very often on projects. We both have our own creative projects all the time. And so this was kind of a new experience for us to really collaborate on one project together. And I think it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was. I'm probably exaggerating when I say it got heated a lot. It wasn't heated. It was a lot, and it was emotional, but not because we were disagreeing, just because we were both passionate about things. And it always sucks when you have to decide whether somebody's in or out.
Yeah.
Right.
And this was a case when there were multiple people that we had to say, hey, we just can't, or that we had to go back to with hard feedback sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't always necessarily because what they had written was wrong. Sometimes it's like, for this book, it's going to need to be this way.
Yeah. That's a conversation we've had over at the Habit membership more than once, is the fact that your colleague's piece got accepted and yours didn't doesn't mean necessarily that one was better than yours. It may be it just doesn't fit, or there are lots of reasons.
That selection process was about a lot of things, not just about the quality, but about we could see the big picture of where things were going to fit into that big picture. We knew the scope and the variety that we wanted. Different kinds of creatures for Ned to draw, things like that. It's kind of like when I was a magazine editor and I had to put together a bunch of different articles into something that felt coherent. And there is the, making something sound like that author's voice, but you also have to make it work with the whole, the whole thing. And, so that did require some, going back to some authors and saying, oh, this is great, but we need it to fit the larger story being told, and we need to fit it to fit tonally. So yeah, that was
crossing the threshold of it being good enough is just one of the. Obviously, it has to be good enough.
Well, I would even argue that that's not even the threshold sometimes. Sometimes it's about whether the idea is good enough.
Yeah.
Because I think there were some stories that, just on a writing level, I might have thought this is not good enough. But the kernel of the idea at the heart of it was really something that I thought, you know what? I love this idea enough that I want to work with this writer to polish this up and make it good enough because it's an idea that I want in the book.
Yeah.
And so that can be part of it too. And then there could be another story that's very well written that just didn't have an idea at its core that was, lighting me up in the same way. So it's complicated.
Yeah. That's a great clarification that even good enough isn't the threshold.
Yeah. Were turned down some that were like, it really broke my heart to turn them down because they were clearly really talented writers. Great writing, but it was an idea and a story that wasn't working and would have required just too much unstitching and restitching. Yeah. So it wasn't about the quality of writing, and that's hard. It's hard.
Yeah. Let's talk about genre. And there are a lot of, we've talked about different story ideas and different creatures, but there's also a lot of different genres in the book.
Yeah.
There's at least one narrative poem in there.
Oh, so let me talk about that really quickly.
Okay.
So the only part of the book that is written in verse is by Malcolm Geit. And he is actually staying upstairs right now. And I was hoping he could pop in and join us today, but I don't think that's going to work out. But he told me last night, I got to show him the hard copy of the book for the first time, and he was absolutely delighted.
Yeah.
And he said, it's a funny thing, like when you're writing or when you're when you're doing something, your brain often wants to go off and do something else, right? So if there's something in front of you that you have to do, inevitably what happens is that you would prefer to be doing the other thing.
Yeah.
And so he said that how this Galahad poem of his had come about was he was actually doing his taxes. And he desperately didn't want to be doing his taxes. And he decided that what he should do instead was to go off and write a poem about Galahad. And he did, and it just all spilled out.
Oh, that's great.
And I think, well, I should probably not discuss it, but I think he might have more Galahad in him.
Oh, good.
May come out in some form or fashion eventually.
Excellent. Well, when I heard about this project and you invited me to contribute, my first thought was, I'm going to write a poem. And then I heard Malcolm Geit was writing a poem, and I thought,
my one regret is that there's not more poetry in the collection. I would like to have had more, but that's
what was it? Flannery O'Connor was talking about when she talked about Faulkner. She said, you don't want to have your mule and wagon stuck on the train track when the Dixie Special is coming down the line. And that's kind of what I felt when I heard that Malcolm was doing it.
He wants to be. Yeah,
it's the kind of thing I'm always telling people not to think. Right. But it's hard not to think. I'll be found wanting if my poem is put up next to Malcolm.
Right. But we do have a ballad. We have a journal. We have what else do we have? We have a fairy story, like a story that's written by fairies.
Okay.
What else?
That one was hard to translate.
Yeah. We have detective fiction.
Oh yeah, there's a detective story. That's right. I forgot about that. By an actual detective writer.
Yeah.
A writer of mysteries.
Oh, that's great.
Mark Bertrand.
Yeah,
it's so fun.
Yeah, and then there's lots of comedy, and then you get into the stuff I like, which is more, high epic kind of things. That's Doug and me, I guess.
Yeah. And yours, Pete, is a kind of an homage to Walt Wangren.
Yeah, the book is actually dedicated to Walt. The dedication is dedicated to Walt Wangren, a true knight of the king. So Walt was a friend and a mentor and a real gift to the whole Rabbit Room community for a long time. And I think, as most of your listeners probably know, one of our great writers. And he died during the process of making this book, which was really emotional for me.
Yeah.
And I had not written a story. Actually, I wrote it before he died. I knew that he was coming to the end of his life. And when I sat down to write the story, for whatever reason, I ended up writing a tale that was sort of inspired by the Book of the Dun Cow and its characters. And it's about an old knight named Sir Walter, who is approaching the end of his story. And so it was really emotional. Like I wrote it, and then I was terrified to give it to him because I thought it would sound like I was killing him or something. Because it has that kind of note of finality to it. But it was really an homage to me because I recognized that, he had just meant a lot to the community and to me and to American letters in general. And that was all coming to an end. And then he died in the middle of it. And then actually, as part of his kind of eulogy, I published the novel online, or the short story online, and got a lot of feedback from people who knew him saying thank you, that it felt like a perfect fitting kind of homage to him. So that was a weird, sort of rare blessing that I didn't plan, but felt meant to be. And it may also, in retrospect, made me so sad that he didn't write a story for this book.
I know.
Because he would have been perfect for it. Like he would have just knocked it out of the park. We went up to help clean out his office after he passed away. And he had been working on several novels, and multiple novels that he was in the process of were medieval novels about saints. Written in that style. And it just makes me a little sad that he didn't get the chance to go the Galahad route, because he would have loved it.
Yeah.
So it felt right to dedicate the book to him.
That I thought that was just right.
Yeah.
And Jennifer, your piece is the introduction.
That is my piece. Yes. And many of the footnotes. The footnotes were a collaborative effort between me and Pete and the authors themselves. So that was super fun. But yeah.
It was an interesting process, even like, who's ever heard of an editorial process for footnotes? But there was this thing that we went through at the end of the book where we were trying to kind of harmonize the tone of the footnotes. You remember that? Which is because, some of the authors would put their own footnotes in, and sometimes it'd be like, well, that obviously just doesn't sound like the right voice, but if it was a good joke, we wanted to make it work.
All the footnotes had to sound like they were coming from the same voice. So we left that to the end. We did all the editing of the stories first, literally printed out the whole book. And then Pete and I separately went through and just started, changing or adding or sprinkling these extra footnotes all the way through, and just massaging like this understory, that was going on the whole way through, which was so much fun. And some stories, those footnotes are all the author. Some they're all us. Some of them they're a mixture. That was a delightful part of the process.
The footnotes are so fun, and are so. I love the way, Jennifer, you set up in the introduction. A world that these footnotes make sense in, and that introduction is so Jennifer Trafton, even though it says what is it, Guinevere of Trafton. See, I put that. I figured it out. I hope I'm not outing you as the true writer of this, but
that's a hard one to figure out.
I have always taken great pride in the fact that my name and Jennifer's names are Arthur and Jennifer, which is Arthur and Guinevere.
Yeah.
So the chance to be the king and queen of this Galahad tale was a lot of fun. It was also interesting in the footnotes, like there were strange considerations you run up against because we're having fun with them. But then you get to a story like Doug McKelvey's, which is wonderful and moving and powerful and dark. And you realize that, hey, there are a number of great jokes to be made here that would snap the reader right out of the spell of this tale.
Yeah.
And so like with a note like Doug's, there's a couple of notes right off the bat just to maintain a continuity. And then it's like, we need to get out of the way. because it's just going to interrupt, the spell that's being cast.
Yeah. So the more serious stories, we tried to keep those footnotes or in the background.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And then I also I don't want to finish up this podcast without really giving a shout out to Ned Bustard, who is the real driving force behind this book.
Yeah.
It was his idea. He was passionate about it. And when I didn't have time to really get the ball rolling, he took it on himself to get the ball rolling. And he's the guy that's driven this thing to the conclusion that it's come to. And also, the book that he has produced is physically just an amazing artifact.
Yeah, it is gorgeous.
It's just gorgeous. His illustrations, his design on the interior, his cover design. And this is interesting. This book was a collaboration from beginning to end, even physically, because Ned did his cover design, and it has this kind of pattern of debossed trees on the cover that were meant to be, no ink. It's just a debossing. It's just a texture that's on the cover. And we sent it off to the factory, and they sent us back a couple of samples, and they said, hey, here's what you asked for, but here's this idea that we think would be even cooler. And if you want us to do this, we won't even charge you for it.
Really?
And they had added this sort of holographic shimmer to all the tree embossing on the cover. And we were like, yes, absolutely, 100%. We want to do that. And so there was even this sort of collaboration that happened with the factory, which I've never encountered before.
Yeah, I've never
Especially when they're like, hey, and if we like it so much, we'll do it for free.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was great.
Well, yeah, Ned did such both the interior, the inside, the outside. It's just a beautiful book. And it was so fun to see Ned, start with this great idea, and then the end result be so fantastic.
Yeah.
And
and he wrote for it too.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, and another thing we should not fail to mention is that, I think the book is going to be a great read aloud for a lot of folks. As a parent, be aware that it does get darker toward the end. Yeah. But it's all, there's nothing inappropriate going on. And they're fun stories that I like. That was one of the visions Ned had, that he wanted it to be something that families could read together. And I think it serves that purpose. And I'll be really interested to see and hear feedback on whether that's true or not.
Yeah.
I would have loved and adored this book when I was a 10, 12, 15-year-old. I would have worn it out, read it 14 times. I couldn't have got enough of it. Yeah.
Jennifer, is this the kind of thing you would have read when you were young?
Yeah. I would have loved it.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of those, what is that famous old book that I think all of us in my generation had as a kid, that was the Norse myths. It was this collection of all the Norse myths about, Pandora's box to Odin's raven and all that kind of stuff, and had this really peculiar sort of art in it that to this day I can see in my mind. And I can't remember the name of it, but it's really famous. That might be the one. But I feel like this is my sort of version of that. It would have done the same thing for my childhood mind. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. Well, I'm so proud of y'all, proud of Ned and all these writers. By the way, how many stories are in this book?
25.
Wow.
And I think a good half of those are habit writers.
I think that's right.
The exact number. But this felt, we've been talking about collaboration, and this felt like exactly what the Rabbit Room is supposed to be doing in terms of, this is a book that comes directly out of a community. Yeah. A community of very experienced writers and brand new writers and everyone in between. And it felt very right. And I'm proud that we got to do this, and that we get to introduce people to writers who, in our community, that maybe this is the first time that their work is getting out there into the world. I'm thrilled about that.
Well, I just am so thrilled with the work y'all have done. So thrilled for these members of the Habit who are, finding themselves in print, many of them for the first time. So So thanks for the work you've done, King Arthur and Queen Guinevere of the Lost Forest, the Wild Forest, sorry. And I can't wait to see this book make its way in the world.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Well, thanks for having us, man.
Yeah.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. To check out more of our podcasts, visit rabbitroom.com/podcast. Our work at The Rabbit Room would be impossible without the generous support of our membership. If you'd like to learn more about membership at The Rabbit Room, visit rabbitroom.com/member. And thanks for listening.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.